But first, Arts Council England and Westminster City Council are some of the public institutions to recently lose tribunals against former female employees who had expressed gender-critical views and then been attacked as transphobic or discriminatory and were made to feel by colleagues that they were no longer fit to do their jobs. Now the Open University is the latest to lose a case against a feminist former member of staff, the Professor of Criminology, Jo Phoenix, my first guest this morning. Professor Phoenix set up the Gender Critical Research Network at the Open University and was also found to have suffered victimisation, harassment and direct discrimination. A reminder, if you need it, that gender critical feminists believe sex is biological, immutable and should be prioritised over gender identity. We can get into some of that with her research very shortly, but Professor Phoenix, let me first welcome you to the programme. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And it was quite a day, I imagine, for you yesterday. What did that mean, that ruling?
It meant everything. It's very difficult to even find a single word for what it meant. I wasn't expecting it. I was hoping for the win, but I wasn't expecting the judgment yesterday. I had kind of settled in for a long wait, if you like. After all, Rachel Mead's case took 7 months before she got her judgment. And so when I got the message from the wonderful, amazing solicitor that I've had, Annie Powell from Lee Day, that the judgment was in, and I was able to look at it, well, let's just say it blew apart any plans I had for the day completely.
But you just mentioned Rachel Mead there, and I had mentioned in my introduction about a series of cases recently. She's a social worker who was suspended for expressing gender-critical beliefs. So Westminster Council was her employer, just to remind people, because not everybody is as across this.
Yeah, apologies.
No, please don't apologise. I just like to always bring our listeners with us if I can. I recognise it's difficult to express how that felt, but you felt you had no choice to take this fight. Is that right?
100%. It's very difficult. I am of a generation of academics who was taught that, at least within our fields, there are no questions that should be off limit, even if those questions might be politically unpalatable for some. That our duty as academics is to pursue those questions, to figure out the answers, to contribute to public debate, to understand policies. So when I saw the effect that Stonewall was having in universities, and we can come to that later if you'd like to, it certainly was one of the contributing factors to what happened to me, I became very worried. In addition to that, because of my own academic expertise around issues to do with male violence and female victims of it, I thought that actually now was the time that I could speak up. Now, I say that, Emma, because, and forgive me, I hope this doesn't sound arrogant. I don't like to feel that way. By the time 2018, 2019 rolled round, I'd already had my professorship. I'd had some amazing jobs at wonderful universities, and I was settling into being just a senior professor, if you like. And in that position, there's very little that a university can take away from you if you're doing something that is like heterodox or out of favor. So I thought I, amongst others, could speak because many of my younger colleagues couldn't. However, what I did not anticipate and what I never thought of was that they could take my name away from me, my mental health away from me, and my good working relations, not just in the Open University, but nationally and internationally. So I suppose on one level I was a little naive. I can just
go on. No, I was going to say that we will come to what your concerns were and all of this, and actually your work, which is important to get to as well, your field of study. I don't have a statement from Stonewall, but you can put those concerns out in a moment. And I have interviewed the former chief exec before myself, but on this programme, which people could listen to as well. But I wanted to come to what actually happened to you, because that's a huge thing to say, that they took your name, and you say Open University did that, the culture, I imagine, around that. You're talking about colleagues. I quoted one of your colleagues. What did happen to you?
The story is quite, I'll try and distill it because it's a very long and very sorry tale. In 2019, a conference that was due to take place at the Open University with the Center for Crime and Justice Studies was cancelled. And at that point, I made it clear to all of my colleagues how much I disagreed with the cancellation of that conference. The conference had been cancelled because the director of the Center for Crime and Justice Studies was accused by several of my colleagues of being a transphobe for tweeting Happy Human Female Day on International Women's Day. And despite what they said to me, I knew that at least, 2 or 3 of my colleagues cancelled that conference because of accusations of transphobia. Anyway, I won't go into the details of that, but it was at that moment that I made it very publicly known to my colleagues that I was both gender critical and that I thought that accusations of transphobia had no place in a university, and certainly no place in a university to close down debate. Now, around that time, I had also signed both of the letters penned by Kathleen Stock, now known as the Stock letters, if you like, in The Guardian and the Times. I had given a talk for an organization called Women's Place UK, and various other things. So I was building up, if you like, a corpus of statements, at least, saying that accusations of transphobia were wrong, that, in some circumstances, for some organizations, it's more important to categorize by sex rather than gender identity, and that accusations of transphobia function to cancel academics and silence them. Anyway, we fast forward. There's a lot in the judgment. If people want to read about the background, they can.
But I suppose what you're saying there is what you did to allow people around you to know your position, which is important to lay out. But what was could you give us, people can go and read the judgment, but could you give us a flavour of what happened to you in response to that?
Yeah. So, you mentioned I got called the racist uncle at the Christmas dinner table, and I'm very, very pleased to see that vindication in the judgment. One of my colleagues called me in for a talk. In the course of that talk, she made that comment. I was very upset. I was crying. And, that's not something I do at work. So that happened. There was silence within my own department. The things that I did that were successful were hardly ever mentioned, certainly wasn't given praise. But then we get to a very critical moment. So there was all sorts of ostracization, silencing, whispering campaigns, complaints to my dean. Nobody ever faced me with these. This was stuff that went behind. So there was a feeling of hostility, if you like. But then shortly after the Forstater judgment came through, the appeal judgment, myself, John Pike, and a number of others opened the OU Gender Critical Research Network. And if I were to say to you, the day that we did that was both the proudest moment of my life so far, second proudest moment of my life. I'll come to the first one later. But it was also one of the darkest days of my life, because within hours of us launching that, the hostility campaign, the public targeted campaigns of hostility just went into hyperdrive. My direct colleagues, people that I've known and worked with, opened an open letter on Google Docs. They published to the world that the Open University Gender Critical Network was transphobic. Several other colleagues from across the university penned other open letters that, to my knowledge, may even still be up on the Open University's internal websites. And all of these letters said the same thing. Gender critical beliefs and the Gender Critical Research Network is transphobic, that the Open University ought to close it down, that we were contributing to in some cases, one of the letters said we were contributing to the murder of trans people. So it was very, very direct. Now, they claimed that it was about the network and not about me, but I was one of the founding members of it. And then, of course, once things got public, there was a Twitter pile-on, the like of which I've never experienced in my life. And within days around that time period, my memory is very hazy. I had what can only be described as a post-traumatic break. I lost it, basically. I fell apart. And then shortly after that, I wrote a grievance to the university. I put out my case to the university that all of these complaints about transphobia were vexatious, that they were humiliating, and that they were not academic freedom. This was a hostile campaign against me, and the OU, for various reasons, basically took a very, very long time to pursue that grievance, and even to today, there has not been a result of that grievance. Meanwhile, the Open University were making statements on their public website as well as internally that that they recognized that the OU GCRN had caused harm to the trans and non-binary community, but they actually never, certainly in those early days, they actually never said that gender critical beliefs were protected in law.
And the key tribunal finding, just taking it back to yesterday, is that the Open University did not protect you during this time.
Yes. Yeah, there was a failure to protect me, and the failure to protect me in the tribunal finding was because the OU did not want to be seen to be siding with anyone with gender critical views. Now, what's really, really important to this whole judgment and this process is that I was working in an organization that had more or less, I want to say imbibed. My words aren't very good today, but, had drunk the culture of Stonewall. So it was an organization in which gender affirmative views were in the majority.
So the idea that if you say you are a woman, if you say you are a man, you are those things, if I could put it in those terms.
Yeah.
And you're ascribing that to the influence of Stonewall, and perhaps we'll get to, for those who don't know, the charity that is of course famous as well for its work on lesbian and gay rights. Again, hotly contested whether people feel it's still doing that, but we can get to that. You're saying you feel that culture had been imbibed. Go on.
Well, it was one, and we can debate about the influence of Stonewall, and I'm prepared to bracket that off. What I can say to you was that there was a deeply ingrained culture that self-identity ruled supreme, and that any form of gender critical expression was ipso facto transphobic. Right. And within that context, the fact that the OU didn't actually back me, and when I say back me, just make simple statements like Joe's gender critical beliefs and those of the OU GCRN are protected. Right? Nothing like that happened. So we were basically, I say we, because, it's not just me, it's the other members of that network, were basically in the eye of a hideous public targeted campaign, and the OU failed in its job, and that causes me a great deal of grief because I once loved the OU.
Yes, I read that you wished to retire there, and that was where you wanted to carry on your work and keep going. What has and what was the impact on you personally?
It's again, these are things that hyperbole doesn't even get there. It has been the hardest 4 to 5 years of my life, 6 years. And, anyone who read my witness statement will know I've had quite a background already. But since everything started in 2019, I've gone, it affected my mental health, as I said. I've gone to some very dark places. As a professional academic, I occupy a position of doubt. And so for the last several years, I've been like, I think I have a case. I really think I have a case. I think all of this was wrong. But what if I'm wrong?
Because you felt you had to resign. I just want to make sure we've also put that in the listener's mind, and they know that. It should be relatively obvious for the fact you had a tribunal. But we should say that you felt you had to do that. And you also just alluded to having dealt with very difficult things in your past. Are you able to say more about that and how this was in comparison? Because I think that's an important thing to be able to calibrate the effect this sort of situation can have on people, because you have a voice to do that.
Yeah. It's out in the public domain. When I was a teenager, I grew up in Texas. I'm English. My parents emigrated over there. I grew up in Texas. And when I was a teenager, I was raped by 2 boys, one man, one girl, one boy at school. And I took the case through on both of I made a complaint to the police and went through the whole criminal justice process as a teenager. I was 15. At that point, it blew apart my ability to do anything. And I was a runaway, and trust and believe in the 1970s, if you're a young lesbian runaway, you see things you really shouldn't have seen. And so by the time I got to the age of 18, I spent 3 years, and it's not something I want to go into detail, but just say I know a lot about street life. And by the time I was 18, I was able to come over here and begin to heal. So having to survive, and I say survive my early life, to then be at a point in my later career where I'm looking at my own employer and saying, please believe me that these awful things are happening, to be then treated like I was. I mean, it was kind of like insult upon injury upon deep hurt. Because the thing is that a lot of that public campaign, and as the tribunal found, that was conscious. It was targeted. It was widespread. That wasn't by accident. And you know, my direct colleagues who I worked with knew my history of sexual violence. You know, so those kind of like spiraling effects, they end up destroying your own sense of who you are professionally and personally. And then to have to take or have the, I mean, people talk about it as courage. I don't know if it's that, but to have the ability to wake up each morning and go back to the Crowd Justice Fund, to ask people for money. I hate asking people for money, but to have to ask people for money to fund a public case, and then the thing I haven't been able to talk about yet is the effect of actually being in that hearing and having a very good KC cross-examine you was perhaps as bad as the experience at the OU, as the experience in my young life. I said to you earlier that second proudest moment, my first proudest moment was, again, it's a matter of public record. I broke down on the last day that I was being cross-examined, and the judge kindly gave me some time to collect myself. I went out. I had a cigarette. I know I shouldn't admit that. I was with my partner and one of my witnesses, Professor Sarah Earle, who's been there with me throughout. They managed to calm me down. The thing I am most proud of was after all of that, I walked back into that hearing knowing that I was going to get another extreme cross-examination. And I was able to sit through 3 weeks of that.
I mean, it's very striking to hear. You said it very briefly there, but that this experience is even in any way comparable to surviving a rape and the process that followed a rape in terms of the impact it's had on you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about it, right, our criminal justice system is, adversarial. The tribunal system is also adversarial. So the opposite side's job was to, in a sense, take apart my story, to examine it in forensic detail. And the only thing you can do when somebody's saying, I've been harassed, I've been discriminated against, is to basically argue, no, you haven't. Now, where do we know that story from? I've been raped. No, you haven't. And as I sat there in the box, if you like, being cross-examined, in the back of my head, I was just going through literally all the kind of tactics that are used within a rape trial, going, tick, that one. Now I'm going to get accused of this. Now I'll be accused of that. And almost every single one of them, from attention seeking to not really being that upset to, you know, just all of those things that women victims get thrown at in court. I mean, I don't want to be hyperbolic about this, but, you know, that's what happens when we have to subject ourselves to what is, in effect, an adversarial justice, civil justice system. So, yeah.
Sorry, what were you about to say?
The parallels were too big for me. And I mean, that was one of the reasons that I actually broke down, was because I couldn't deal with it anymore.
Have any of your colleagues been in touch, either since you mounted this case, the ones who accuse you of being transphobic, or since your victory? I know it was only yesterday, since your win. Have they ever said, you know what, I've had to think about this, calling you a racist uncle through to whatever else was said or written?
No. No, and I'm almost 100% convinced that, of the 360 plus people who signed that open letter, they were all people who were at the OU, colleagues, not students. Of all of those people who signed that letter, I can imagine that there's a good percentage that got caught up in a moment, if you like, and just like the mob moment, that probably regret what they did. But there has not been a single person yet who has apologized for a misplaced tweet, apologized, or even just said, as you said, I've had to think about this. Maybe it was a bit wrong. No.
And you stand by the fact that you know nothing that you feel you've tweeted or said or done. This is not calling into question yesterday's ruling at all. Is anything you should think about again, because tempers are very hot on this. In terms of your whole thing is around freedom of speech. Yeah. I know you care deeply about it. You want to be able to have those arguments freely and without people, not saying what they think. Is there anything that you've reflected on?
No, I mean, I would say, and I've said it in the court of law, and I said it to anyone who will listen to me, I do have a potty mouth. I am known for swearing. So one or two of my tweets have been a little sweary Mary. There's no two ways about it. Some of my tweets have been very gallows humor, but certainly in my professional conduct and when I'm actually beginning to talk about the real issues, no, there is nothing. I stand by everything that I have said, and indeed the tribunal found that. Yes. They went through 3 years of course, private
but people again may not read the judgment, and I think it's important to ask you the question because I'm very struck. We've got a lot of messages, reacting to different parts of what you've had to say, and many in support, I have to say as well. But we have a message that's come in here, and we don't have time to go through in a lot of detail. But I hope you'll come back. Well, no, but I hope you'll come back to talk about your area of expertise because it's something we do talk about on the programme, and I've certainly done many interviews in this area. But it pertains to this, which is this message here, which says, "I'm a woman. I'm not young. I'm not LGBTQ+, and I'm not afraid of trans people. I don't know what you're afraid of." This is directed to you. "I don't feel compromised. You seem to like freedom of speech as long as it's yours. Trans is a protected characteristic and should be, as they are, a vulnerable minority." And I suppose I wanted to give you the chance to respond to that because I was interested in your research and how it relates, your area of academic expertise relates to your gender critical beliefs around criminology, around where we put prisoners in this country.
Very, very happily. I'm not afraid of trans people. I strongly support people's right to identify as they wish. It would be ridiculous for me not to. I'm a lesbian, for goodness sake. And I, was around before the Equality Act. But there's a difference between supporting trans individuals or supporting everyone in their identity and their self-expression and how we organize complex organizations like prisons or like hospitals, for instance. So the thing isn't about being afraid of trans people, and it's not about freedom of speech or not, but we have to be able to ask, in the context of prisons, for instance, is a self-identification policy in which male-bodied individuals who identify as women write for the prisons. The prisons is not, it's not like, I don't know, cinemas. Prisons are very specific places. And we know an awful lot about women in prison. And we know we're beginning to know quite a bit about male people who identify as women. We're beginning to understand a little bit more about their, if you like, I hate using this word because it's a little bit Netflix, about their profile, if you like. We're beginning to understand the sort of backgrounds and index offenses that they have. So in many senses, that whole question about being afraid of trans people, that has nothing to do with it whatsoever. I'm coming from an organizational and policy point of view. And I would never say that in all places, at all times, we ought to organize by sex. I just say in some places, at some times, it's more important that we understand sex and organize by that rather than gender identity.
Let's have a chat in the future then about that when it's back on the agenda, I'm sure, with an election, certainly in England, talking about how prisons will be organised, not least Scotland as well. We can talk further, but just a final thought from you before I give a couple of statements. today, which I know you're still gathering your thoughts on. Do you still have an appetite to debate? Do you still want to be, who you are as a career? Because my gosh, you've been doing it in a whole other way over the last few years, and it's nice to hear you laugh and smile. But go for it, because I always think when people have been through something, they might re-emerge differently.
Yeah, that's what, like this. Ask me tomorrow, I might give you a different answer. Yes, of course I do. Most of my job has been about trying to understand all the complexities and the nuances and have discussions about them. And I want to see the hunger in younger people's eyes, the students that I teach and the colleagues that I have, and I want to take part in that. And I love it when people disagree with me. So do I.
I don't know if that's going out of fashion, but you sound like you've not gone off that bit of it. I thought I'd at least ask you that, because I think that's, you've been through a process, and people go through these processes and they can change. Big smile on your face this morning, as I'm sure there was yesterday, and you were tweeting about celebrating last night. So it's good that you were up early enough to have the conversation after I saw some champagne posted. Professor Joe Phoenix, thank you for your time and explaining how you see things this morning. We've got some statements. Stonewall have declined to give a statement there. There was a conversation starting about what influence has happened on institutions. As we heard from the professor there, she felt that the influence of that particular organisation had an impact where she had worked. Professor Tim Blackman, Vice-Chancellor of the Open University, says, we acknowledge that we can learn from this judgment on we are considering the findings very carefully. We are deeply concerned about the well-being of everyone involved in the case and acknowledge the significant impact it has had on Professor Phoenix, the witnesses and many other colleagues. Our priority has been to protect freedom of speech while respecting legal rights and protections. We're disappointed by the judgment and will need time to consider it in detail, including our right to appeal. And just messages, I read one there who was concerned about Professor Joe Phoenix's views, but there's one here just saying, this is happening across the university sector. All universities need to read this judgment and protect academic free speech, including gender-critical beliefs. I left an academic career after 25 years after the case of Raquel Rosario Sanchez at Bristol University. You can look that up. I gave evidence in her case against the university. This judgment is crucial. Well done for your courage, Joe, says Dr. Emma Williamson. And so it carries on. Thank you for those messages. I'll come back to them if I can. But today, something else marks a big day for the